They sent 2 agents, armed with everything they thought they needed to break you. Confident and prepared, they came with manipulation, strategy, and intimidation, expecting an easy victory. They believed you were just another target, someone to be controlled, subdued. But something unexpected happened. One of them returned, not with success, but with resignation. Your dossier, the one they thought would break you, did the opposite. It revealed a power within you that couldn't be touched by their threats, a strength that withstood every form of pressure they tried. They thought they could play the game on their terms, but in the end, it was your unshakable resolve that dismantled their best agent. They sent 2, but only one walked away. And not with victory, but with the humbling realization that some forces can't be controlled or defeated. True power doesn't always fight back. Sometimes it's simply the refusal to bend. Now, if you're still with me, it's no accident. Hit that like button. Subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers, and leave a comment for them. This is your moment to amplify the energy and alignment you're stepping into. The truth that only the strongest grasp is unfolding right now. Keep pushing forward. From the moment the mission briefing began, it was clear this would be like every other. 2 of the agency's most elite operatives, backed by a reputation for success, were tasked with neutralizing a target. It wasn't supposed to be difficult. After all, this was a world built on power, manipulation, and the ability to intimidate, where threats were made and broken at the drop of a hat. The dossier on the target was thick, filled with secrets, vulnerabilities, and just enough of a trail of destruction to make them a clear threat to the established order. It should have been straightforward, routine, but there was something unsettling in the air. The agents, normally so confident in their abilities to dismantle any situation, felt an edge of uncertainty as they prepared for the operation. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this mission would not unfold as planned. This time, they wouldn't be facing someone who would break under pressure. This time, they were about to encounter an unyielding force, a quiet strength they couldn't predict. The agents carried not only the best tools of strategy and psychological warfare, but also a brutal certainty that they could bend anyone to their will. Yet as they approached their target's last known location, something began to gnaw at the edges of their resolve. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something they couldn't quite articulate. Were they prepared for what lay ahead? Or was this the one mission that would unravel everything they believed about power and control? The agents stood on the precipice of their mission, each one exuding the kind of confidence that comes from years of taking down the impossible. Their plan was flawless. They were the best at what they did, trusted by the highest echelons of power to carry out the toughest of assignments. Every move was calculated, every angle covered, and every possible threat accounted for. They had studied their target for months, understood their weaknesses, and knew how to exploit them. Nothing could go wrong. Or so they thought. When they finally met the protagonist face to face, nothing about the situation was as expected. There was no dramatic showdown, no fiery resistance. There wasn't even a flicker of fear in the eyes of the target. Instead, they were greeted with an eerie calmness, an unnerving serenity that felt almost out of place in the world of manipulation and power. What was this person made of? How could they be so unshakable? In that moment, for the first time, the agents realized something unsettling. Their plan, so meticulously crafted, was already failing. It was as if their every tactic, every piece of psychological warfare was being absorbed and neutralized without effort. Their words, which had broken countless others, fell flat. The power they carried in their presence had no effect. This wasn't just an obstacle. This was something entirely different, something that couldn't be bargained with or bullied into submission. And with every passing second, the realization sank in deeper. Their power wasn't enough. The dossier they carried with them was supposed to be their secret weapon, a detailed account of the protagonist's life, fears, and deepest secrets. The document was meant to provide leverage. After all, everyone had a weakness. Everyone could be manipulated if the right buttons were pushed. The agents were experts in this, exploiting the vulnerable points, the past traumas, the unspeakable fears. They had done it countless times before, and it had always worked. Yet as they read through the dossier, they began to realize something shocking. This wasn't an ordinary person. The target's past was riddled with pain, with loss, with hardship, but there was no trace of desperation or weakness. Instead, the protagonist's story was one of survival, of growing stronger with each setback. The more the agents read, the more they began to understand the core of this person's strength. It wasn't in their circumstances, but in their ability to transcend them, to stand unflinching against the darkness that had tried to break them. In one chilling moment, the agents recognized the most profound truth about the target. They had no fear. The secrets within the dossier weren't vulnerabilities. They were the building blocks of resilience. They had expected to find leverage, but what they found instead was a mirror reflecting their own weaknesses. The more they tried to grasp for control, the more they found themselves slipping. The dossier, rather than providing answers, was a revelation that shattered their understanding of power. For the first time, the agents were faced with a person who could not be manipulated. No amount of threats, no weapon of intimidation could reach them. They weren't dealing with a victim. They were facing an individual who had mastered the art of inner strength. And that was something the agents couldn't comprehend or conquer. In the world of covert operations, power is measured by how much influence you have over others, how easily you can manipulate, intimidate, or control. But the protagonist was different. Their power wasn't loud. It wasn't demanding, and it certainly wasn't in your face. It was quiet. It was composed. It was a presence so serene, so unshakable, that it rendered everything the agents had relied on meaningless. There was no fear, no desperation to exploit, no sign of breaking. They simply stood firm. This kind of strength is not something that can be easily understood. It's not the strength of brute force nor the strength of words. It's the strength of clarity, the ability to remain calm in the face of chaos, the ability to find peace amidst the storm. And that kind of power doesn't break. It doesn't bend. It simply withstands. The agents, so used to pushing and prodding until something gives, were now in the presence of a person who had nothing to give. They couldn't crack the surface because there was no surface to crack. It was in that silence that the agents felt the first stirrings of doubt. They tried to push, to provoke, but their words fell away like leaves in a windstorm. The protagonist stood unwavering, their eyes calm and steady. And with that steady gaze, something began to shift in the agents. What they thought was their strength began to feel like weakness. In a world where manipulation was key, they were suddenly powerless. The true power of silence, the mastery of oneself, was a weapon they had never encountered. And it was the one the agents had expected to take control of the situation immediately. They were trained for this. They knew how to use fear, pressure, and subtle manipulation to bend anyone to their will. But the moment they made eye contact with the protagonist, something in them shifted. It was subtle at first, a tiny, almost imperceptible feeling, but it grew. The agents found themselves hesitating. Was this person really as powerful as they seemed? What was it about them that made the air feel thick with something unspoken? The protagonist's presence was magnetic, not because they exuded force, but because they radiated something far more dangerous: certainty. In that first encounter, the agents tried to assert their authority, using their words like weapons, trying to get a reaction, a crack in the armor. But they received nothing. No fear, no anger, just the same quiet confidence, the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. For the first time in their careers, the agents found themselves on the defensive. Every move they made was countered by an unspoken calm, and every attempt to break the protagonist was met with an unwavering refusal to engage. This wasn't just a test of strength, it was a test of character, and the agents realized, too late, that they were out of their depth. Manipulation had always been the agent's weapon of choice. Their tactics were psychological, based on inducing fear, exploiting insecurities, and pushing their targets to the breaking point. But here, they found themselves up against someone who had mastered the art of not being manipulated. Every effort they made to pressure the protagonist only seemed to push them further into stillness. There were no cracks in the facade, no moments of weakness to exploit. They tried every trick in the book, subtle threats, using the protagonist's own past against them, even attempting to sway their emotions with well-placed words. Yet, none of it worked. In fact, it only served to highlight their own limitations. It was as if the protagonist was immune to manipulation, immune to the very tactics that had worked so flawlessly against everyone else. It was as if the protagonist was immune to manipulation, immune to the very tactics that had worked so flawlessly against everyone else. They were like a stone in a river, unaffected by the current of pressure that the agents tried to apply. And in that moment, the agents began to understand. True power isn't about bending others to your will. It's about not being bent yourself. The protagonist wasn't being resistant to their tactics. They simply didn't need to engage. They weren't a pawn to be played. And in that quiet defiance, they had already won. Every mission has its expected course, its prescribed actions, and its inevitable conclusion. But here the mission was falling apart in front of their eyes. The agents had planned for every contingency. They had prepared for violence, for negotiation, for everything in between. But no one had prepared them for this, a complete absence of fear, a calmness so absolute that it left no room for their usual methods to take root. It wasn't just a failure. It was a disruption of everything they thought they knew about power. The protagonist wasn't fighting back. They weren't running. They weren't cowering in fear. They were simply standing. And with that, they rendered the agent's expertise meaningless. Their tools of manipulation, once so sharp, felt dull in comparison. The mission was no longer about victory. It was about survival, about adapting to something that no one had ever taught them to handle. And in that adaptation, something profound was lost: the certainty of control. At the heart of every great power is an even greater mastery over oneself. The protagonist wasn't an ordinary person. They were a force who had learned to control not just their circumstances, but their mind. They had mastered their own fears, doubts, and emotions. And it was this inner strength that proved to be the ultimate weapon. The agents had come armed with force and tactics, but these were nothing against the quiet resolve that stood before them. True strength lies in the ability to stand firm when everything else is falling apart, and it was this mastery of mind that the agents couldn't overcome. Their attempts to break the protagonist were futile because the protagonist had already transcended the need for anything external to validate them. The agents, reliant on external power, found themselves at a loss. The first agent, usually so sure of their abilities, had tried everything they knew, every trick, every word, every threat, and yet nothing had worked. No violence was exchanged, no force was applied. The agent wasn't defeated in combat. They were defeated by a simple truth: some things cannot be broken, and some people cannot be controlled. The moment of realization hit them like a wall. a sudden crushing awareness that they were standing in the presence of someone whose strength could not be undermined. The second agent had seen what had happened to their partner, the failure, the confusion, the unexpected defeat. They were determined not to make the same mistakes. With a steely resolve, they approached the protagonist, hoping that they could break through where the first agent had faltered. Armed with even more precision, with sharper instincts, the second agent attempted to use everything they knew about human nature to break the protagonist's calm exterior. They expected force to win. They expected pressure to yield results. But instead, they found themselves standing on the edge of a precipice where logic and tactics no longer applied. It was like trying to push against an immovable wall. Every attempt to manipulate, to control, was met with the same unshakable strength. There were no cracks, no signs of weakness. The second agent had studied their target just as thoroughly as the first, but there was something they hadn't accounted for: the unbreakable nature of the protagonist's spirit. In this moment of intense realization, the agent found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about power. The more they tried to force the protagonist into submission, the more they realized that their entire strategy was flawed. They weren't facing an enemy who could be defeated. They were facing a force of nature. The realization was not just humbling, it was devastating. The second agent began to understand that true strength had nothing to do with control over others. It was about mastery over oneself. And the protagonist embodied this in ways they had never anticipated. The second agent's resolve began to crumble, piece by piece. It wasn't just the failure of the mission. It was the undeniable truth that they could not win. For the first time in their career, they were completely powerless. The frustration that had bubbled beneath the surface began to spill over, but there was no one to direct it towards. The protagonist hadn't fought them. They hadn't retaliated in any traditional sense. They had simply stood firm, without flinching, without moving a muscle, and in doing so, had stripped away the agent's sense of purpose. The moment the second agent realized this was not a fight to be won, but a lesson to be learned, a wave of resignation washed over them. There was no sense of victory to be claimed, no way to manipulate the situation in their favor. And in that acceptance, something shifted in the agent's heart. Their confidence, built over years of success, collapsed. It wasn't the shock of defeat that unsettled them. It was the realization that the protagonist had defeated them without ever lifting a finger. As they turned to leave, the weight of their failure was heavy. The mission had failed, but so had everything they had ever believed about power. They weren't just walking away from a loss, they were walking away from the shattering of their own identity, their own sense of invincibility. And yet, strangely, there was a part of them that admired the protagonist, even in their defeat. In their silence, they had learned a lesson that would haunt them for the rest of their career. Sometimes, the most dangerous people don't need to fight back. They simply stand. There is a strange power in silence, a power that is often misunderstood or underestimated. People expect power to be loud, aggressive, domineering. They expect it to announce itself, to make its presence known, but the protagonist's strength was entirely different. It was in the quiet, in the stillness that existed between each interaction. The calmness was not the absence of power. It was the very essence of it. The protagonist knew something that the agents had never truly understood. True strength doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to fight back with words or threats. It simply exists, unwavering, unmovable. In their silence, they had not only neutralized the agent's tactics, but had made them question the very nature of control. How could you defeat someone who wasn't playing the same game? How could you force someone into submission when they were already at peace with who they were? This